This is the audio lecture recording for Lecture 15 on medicinal plants and various plant-derived medicines. We need to first, outside of the learning goals, talk briefly about pharmacology. Okay, and so one of the themes that will show up throughout this lecture is the idea that until 1850s, if you were taking a medicine, it was pretty much a plant extract. So if you sit and think about it, there are very few animal extracts that we have used as medicines throughout history. They most all come from plants, and that's partly because the plants are easier to catch. They don't run. They're easier to grow if we want to cultivate them. And there you go. And they're much more numerous than the number of animals that we have domesticated. So now, until 1850s, you're getting your medicines from plants. And then chemistry. Not biology or medicine, really chemistry is the science that has advanced rapidly since the 1850s, and this is how we're getting synthetic medicines. So this is how we synthesize stuff from bulk chemicals, and that's allowed us to make a lot more of these medicines and make them more freely available to people, make them cheaper, because it's easier to dig up chunks of chemical from the ground than it is to grow, harvest, and squeeze juice out of plants. All right, so in general, making these synthetically has been a really good thing. So we're going to break the lecture down into three sections. We're going to talk about some plant compounds that are called alkaloids, and we're going to talk about two famous alkaloids. Okay, so these are going to be secondary plant products, so not primary things for their metabolism, not enzymes they need to survive, but things that give them extra tricks. All right, alkaloids are going to be ones that contain a ring and a nitrogen atom either embedded in the ring or attached to it. So they're going to be ring shapes with a nitrogen. We're going to pick a couple of them, and we're going to list them by the drug that they form and the conditions that the drug treats. Then we're going to focus on the plant. So we'll be moving back and forth between the drug produced and the drug that the plant produces and the plant producing it. And then we're going to use some of those terms, just like we did in the two previous lectures. We'll use some terms from prior lectures, like talking about the type of flower it has and its relatedness. And then we'll also make sure to look at the geographic origin, and we'll look at the modern plant, the modern drug, and determine whether or not the plant is still the primary source of the drug, or are we synthesizing it from scratch. All right, so let's look at alkaloids. Now, before you freak out looking at this picture over here, all I wanted to show you is that alkaloids have rings associated with them and one or more nitrogen atoms. Okay. Interesting thing about why we categorized all of these together as one thing called alkaloids. Most alkaloids are going to be basic because of the nitrogen in them. They're going to have a way to act in the opposite of an acid. They're going to act like a base. Okay, and so because of that, they're going to taste bitter. So these bitter compounds that were being isolated from plants were kind of grouped all together and called the alkaloid medicines. Okay, so that tracks some back to chemistry, but then also is going more to the fact of what it tasted like to the people dealing with it. All right, now also in order to be an alkaloid, by the way, alkaloid is coming from the word alkaline. Like Alka-Seltzer. You think Alka-Seltzer that you take to get rid of stomach acid, because that's what bases do. Alkaline things get rid of acids because they're bases. So the very name is coming from the fact that it's basic. All right. And of course, to be called an alkaloid, it has to be either produced by a plant or the original product has to come from a plant, and then we modified it further. So we'll talk about alkaloid plant derivatives even if we've made them from scratch. Okay, because they have a history of coming from a plant. And then finally, of course, they have to have a significant effect on the human body, or else we wouldn't be talking about them. So they actually have to act as some sort of drug. And so this, for example, is what quinine looks like. And we'll be talking about quinine and ephedrine, or ephedrine. If you want to look at that common ending of INE, a lot of your alkaloids have that INE ending on them as an homage to the presence of this basic nitrogen. Okay, so that's just a little chemistry. You don't have to memorize that. You also don't have to memorize what these things physically look like. All you have to know is that they have rings in them, like, this kind of ring shape, and there's nitrogen. Okay, usually embedded in the ring. Sometimes it'll just be hanging off to the side. Now, let's talk about quinine and let's talk about malaria. Okay, so first off, malaria. So where does malaria come from? It comes from a protist. All right, so that's not a bacterium, that's not a virus. Okay, it's a eukaryote. You know how fungi and protista are both eukaryotes? Malaria comes from a eukaryote, and it's carried by some very specific tropical mosquitoes. They're called the Anopheles mosquito. Okay, so not all mosquitoes in the tropics carry it, and not even all Anopheles mosquitoes carry it. But if you get infected with malaria, and you're living in, let's say, like a third world country, and you don't get some sort of hospitalization treatment, it's got a pretty heinous death rate of 20%. All right, so that's pretty ugly. For comparison, right now, maximum death rate of COVID-19 infections is about 5%, and that's pretty scary for us. And that, of course, that is a treated 5% still, but 5% it scares us, so 20% would be pretty awful. All right, so it still kills 500,000 people, even though we do have treatments for it now. Third world countries still don't have access to the industry necessary to produce it, and it's hard to get it delivered out to the people. Okay, as you can see here, the endemic regions of malaria, the darkest regions, are right here in the middle of Africa. And for perspective, I'm tracing the equator with my mouse right now. So that's how, when we say tropical, we're talking about, you know, just around the equator is where you get the most incidence, okay, of malaria. Now, until 1640, the old world didn't have a cure for malaria. Okay. However, there was a cure in the New World, which was just being discovered by Europe and the rest of the places, and that was the fever bark tree. Okay, which is called fever bark tree, sometimes called the cinchona tree, in honor of the, I think it was the Count of Cinchona or Countess of Cinchona, who brought the tree back to Spain from Peru. So this tree is growing over here in the Americas, is going to be used to produce something called quinine. It's going to be ground up and kind of, you know, soaked as a tea. And that quinine that comes out of the bark is the medication that actually treats malaria. So let's just throw a couple pieces of information out here. Here you see this nice pretty flower, so we know, okay, well, it's an angiosperm. Okay, it sits nicely inside Magnolia phyta, and it's in that family called the asterids. Okay, I'll show you a picture in a minute to remind you of that. Its closest relative that we've spoken of is coffee. All right, and when you see these clusters of flowers, you should also always think, that's an inflorescence. So that's some biology we're throwing in on top of the fever bark tree or the cinchona tree. Okay, now I said I would show you, here are the asterids, and you know you had a lot of different objects in the asterids that we had talked about. We're adding the fever tree over here to the gentianalis. Now you don't have to know these smaller words like lamiids and gentianalis. What you need to walk around knowing is that coffee, mint, and peppers are all close relatives inside the asterids. And then you need to know that fever tree and coffee are best buds now. Okay, buds, get it? Because they're flowering plants. Maybe my family's right. I do have bad dad humor. All right, let's fast forward to more modern treatments. Okay, so in the late 1600s, early 1700s, 1800s, even up to the 1900s, we're taking chloroquine, or we're taking quinine out of the tree. Okay, and now in the 1940s, you're going to see that number a lot. 40s and 50s was a big deal because World War II took American industry and mixed it with a whole bunch of other countries, because suddenly we had an American presence in, you know, South America, in North Africa, all the way over in Asia. So suddenly, at the end of World War II, we go, hey, look at all these neat new plants. Wonder if we can do anything with them. Well, so in the 40s now, we're starting to learn to synthesize the quinine directly and to create the newer modified drugs called chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. And those guys are important because they have fewer side effects and more potency than the natural quinine. All right, and a little bit of a historical note. Tonic water, it's called taking your tonic because it was quinine water. Okay, and tonic water today still contains quinine. Not enough to cause you any kind of problem. Don't worry, you're not drugging yourself. But quinine water used to be the thing that people drank to avoid malaria. And so when you have drinks like the gin and tonic or vodka tonic, that is coming from a way to make quinine water, which is kind of bitter and has to have a lot of sugar in it just to make it drinkable. It's actually become the alcohol was to make it palatable and to convince people to drink it as their treatment for malaria. One more note about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. These guys, if they sound familiar, they showed up in the news right around 2020 and were made famous as possible treatments for COVID-19. As of the time of this recording, jury's still out on whether or not these things called chloroquine here, okay, have any effect on COVID-19. Now, I do want to pause and note right here that there is your ring with your nitrogen embedded, and we have additional nitrogens hanging off of it. There's your chlorine to make chlorine quinine or chloroquine. All right. Now, time to talk congestion. All right. Ephedra is an entire genus of plant. Okay. And all of the members of the genus produce a stimulant that's going to relax your nasal passages. And so that allows congestion to drain out of your sinuses, and it allows congested bronchioles to relax so you can cough and get it out. I did say it was a stimulant, so it also increases your heart rate, and it increases fat burning all at the same time. That's what stimulants tend to do. Now, it's going to be one of these alkaloids, so we know we can predict that it will have a nitrogen ring in it, so a ring with a nitrogen in it. And I like to point out what part of each plant is being used. The ephedra plant is, like kind of like a low-growing, it's almost like a grass when you look at it, or reeds. When you think about thick reeds growing up out of the ground, so they pretty much just rip out the whole plant, grind up the whole thing to get the ephedra. And this has been a remedy in China for congestion for over 3,000 years. So we don't know exactly when it started. But the plant that is most commonly used for ephedra actually has a Chinese name because of it. Interesting side note, in the 80s and 90s, ephedrine became, it was called ephedrine when it was used in drug form. It became a major ingredient of diet pills. You take that, you put some caffeine in there, you put a couple other things, and what you have is you have a diet suppressant that also cranks up your fat burning by a few percentage points. So we'll get to that in a minute. That's going to be an important point. But let's first talk about the ephedra plant. I will call it the ephedra plant, but if you want to, know a little side history, it's called the ma huang. Okay, so I think if I'm pronouncing it correctly, it's huang, like it's almost an O, not a h sound, but a huang. But ma huang is a gymnosperm. Okay, but it's not a conifer. It's a member of a phylum of gymnosperms that has very few remaining members. A whole bunch of natural extinctions happened. This phylum is not very competitive once the conifers came along. So this group that the ephedra plant belongs to, there's like maybe 80 species left instead of the like 700 species of conifer that are out there. Okay, so it's on its way out. Since it's a gymnosperm, we know it has no flowers, and since it's not a conifer, it also doesn't have cones. These little, flower-like, cone-like things on the end right here are its reproductive structure. We're not even going to learn much about this, but this guy is a short plant, and he is perennial. So he's great for an agribusiness product or agri-pharma because you can cut him down, and he'll grow back next year, no-till agriculture, and you can also see it likes aquatic gardens. Okay, so you sometimes see the ephedra plant in fancier aquatic gardening scenarios if somebody has a koi pond or whatever. It even makes sense to put it there given that it comes from the east. All right, so let's talk about ephedrine and diet pills. And by diet pills, I mean heart attacks. Yes, that's right. I told you it raised your heart rate. Well, if you're cranking down diet pills that happen to have something that raises your heart rate, and it's an herbal supplement, Well, see, herbal supplements are not regulated by the FDA. Okay, so the FDA, in general, they're not trying to make a claim that is proven by science, and often the claims don't play out. So they can't pass FDA standards. And since FDA testing is expensive, they're not even going to try. Why bother? But the problem is that also means that the FDA is not able to test to see whether or not this stuff is safe. So the first phase of a clinical trial is a safety phase, and herbal supplements don't go through that. So a lot of popular diet pills were linked to heart attacks in the early 2000s. There was a Harvard study that came out, and as a result of that, the FDA banned use of ephedrine as a diet supplement. So you cannot get over-the-counter ephedrine-containing pills anymore because of that study. But notice, it was done by a university, and it wasn't until 2000. So for 20 years, the older dieting pills were out there causing an unknown number of deaths because no one was really tracking the information. Now, Dexatrim, by the way, made a lot of money being a diet pill, and so was able to survive this process, and Dexatrim still exists now, only it doesn't have ephedrine in it. However, what Dexatrim does have in it, well, I don't know, still not regulated by the FDA, so we're still not sure whether or not it's safe. It's just nothing in it is currently known to be unsafe. So, that brings up some interesting questions. Gee, wonder if that'll show up as a short answer question. Now, while we're talking about all of the controversy associated with ephedrine, let's move on to Sudafed, a very popular medicine that has recently gotten the crap kicked out of it. Okay, so ephedrine was first synthesized in the 1880s. So being moved to chemical plants made it much more common and made it much easier to produce a version of ephedrine called pseudoephedrine, which is just like ephedrine. It's just got a slightly mirror image to it. Like if you hold up your left hand and your right hand, that's the difference between ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. It's kind of, they're mirror images of each other. It is probably the most common nasal decongestant ever prescribed. And of course, it became non-prescription, and people were using it over and over and over again. And it was super effective. And in fact, people still use it. It has a side effect that it does keep you awake because, duh, it's a stimulant. There's a problem with it. It's easy to turn into crystal meth. So if you look on the diagram, this is pseudoephedrine. Okay, if you remove the OH group right here, it becomes what is basically referred to as methamphetamines, or what we call crystal meth. So when you're talking about a person who's a meth addict, that's the component you're looking at. It's just this molecule, but with an OH group, that oxygen removed. And when you remove oxygen, you make things more lipid soluble. And so this guy can cross the blood-brain barrier and really do some wacky things to your brain, which is why it turns from a decongestant into a drug. All right. So because of the removal of that OH group being so easy, we had to outlaw, or at least, outlaw's wrong, control Sudafed. So you can get it without a prescription, but it is still a restricted quantity. So if you try to get real Sudafed, which is the trade name most people know it under, is Sudafed here, because they didn't like spelling PSEU. If you try to get real Sudafed, you have to show your driver's license, you have to be over 18, blah, blah, blah. So it is over the counter, but it is also behind the counter for that reason. Now, over the counter, you'll see a whole bunch of medications that say PE on them now, and that means they contain phenylephedrine. So it's like Sudafed, but we've added an extra OH group over here. So this one was easy to knock off. This one's very hard to take off. So it can't be used as a precursor to making crystal meth, because you would have to take both off, and then for whatever reason that's chemically difficult. So phenylephedrine is a safer alternative as far as the drug trade is concerned, but the problem is it doesn't work as well. And if it did work as well, we would have been using it to begin with. So it's less effective. You can still get the real stuff in a lot of medications. We'll say things like, random allergy medication, and then you'll have random allergy medication D. And the D is code for real Sudafed, and it will be behind the counter at a drugstore. Whereas name of allergy medication PE, that stuff will be out in front of the counter where you can just pick it up off the shelf because that's the phenylphedrine version of it. So there you go. Those were two alkaloid medications derived from plants. Now let's talk about glycoside medications. Once again, we're going to talk about their structure and how they're made from attaching pretty much anything you want. In this case, it's going to be some steroid-like things, okay? Some ring products again, but we won't have the nitrogen. We're going to attach those to a glucose ring, and that's what's going to make them glycosides. Okay. Then we're going to mention two glycosides, and we're going to talk about what they're used for. And then we're, of course, going to dig through the biology and classification of the plant, just like we did for our alkaloids. So we're going to continue that game. And finally, we'll talk about the geography and now the modern use of the drugs and exactly how they're produced. Are they synthesized? Are they still pulled out of plant material? Okay. So, glycosides. The word glyco just means sugar. And so glycosides are plant products that are attached to a sugar molecule. So this is a generic way of showing sugar, glucose. Remember, it had 6 carbons in it. Here's our 6th carbon right here, even though it's not shown. It's implied by the kink there. Okay. So glucose, being a very common thing in a plant, it's a very common thing to build your secondary plant products with glucose attachments. Okay, this right up here is salicylic acid, okay, and this is a glucose molecule. So when you put it together, you get this thing called salicin, and we're going to talk about that as the origin of aspirin. Now, other rules to be a glycoside, well, you're going to have to be produced by a plant or be related to a product produced by a plant, have some kind of plant origin to it, and once again, a significant effect on the human body. Okay, so something other than just being used and digested as calories. All right, so one more thing, you'll find many of the ones, in fact, including the two we referenced today, are going to have this ring shape in them that has no oxygens on the ring. So it's going to look kind of like a steroid, okay, but it won't actually be a steroid. It'll just mimic the action of them some. And an example of a famous steroid, about cortisone shots, and hydrocortisone and things like that. That's an example of a steroid that reduces inflammation. So we're going to talk about these guys as non-steroids that can reduce inflammation. We're going to talk about aspirin, and we're also going to talk about aloe. And to do that, we need to talk about willow bark tea. Yes, willow trees are all around the world, so lots of different cultures have discovered the fact that if you brew a tea out of their bark, you can have some pretty big anti-inflammatory effects. Okay, so what's an anti-inflammatory? It's got several things. There are several features of your immune system that are all kind of linked. When you mount an immune response, your immune system often puts out these chemicals, like the histamines, for example, you've heard of those, that cause your blood vessels to swell and stretch and become leaky. Okay. And also allows liquid as they come out of it. It makes it raises the temperature of wherever you're at and can trigger fever, and also a lot of pain that you feel from like an infected cut or whatever, but also pain from damaged cells. All of that is part of the inflammatory response. And willow bark tea, which we're going to learn later contains aspirin, is blocking your own immune system from doing those things. So if you've got a headache, one of the causes of headaches is swelling of blood vessels in your brain. So this is going to shrink them back up. And like we said, it's blocking fever, so it's getting down your fever. And if you've got sore muscles, they're usually sore because the muscles themselves are actually releasing a chemical that says, "I'm in pain, leave me alone." Okay, so it doesn't really matter what willow tree you use. Black willow is one of the most common in Europe, but willow bark tea, is one of these examples of an excellent natural medicine that totally has its exact same effect even today. It's been proven. Now, willow trees. Okay, the whole genus Salix, from which salicylic acid got its name, or salicin, it got it from the genus name. These guys are, as I said, they're native all around the world, and these are rosids. So they're not asterids, they're rosids. and they're going to be closest linked to apple trees. So I'll show you a picture of these guys from the faded branch. Okay. Now, their flowers, as you can see right here, also grow as an inflorescence. It turns out if you're working with a tree, a lot of trees like producing an inflorescence. Okay, they don't tend to produce single stalks with flowers on them. Okay, and since it is a big old tree, you can harvest that bark perennially off of it. So that's really nice. Okay, I don't think I mentioned it, but it's the same with the fever tree. You can just harvest some of the bark and come back later and harvest some of the bark. You can't do it every year, but you can go back every few years and get a little bit more. Now, if we're talking, tell you what, let me show you that relationship real quick. Here's your willow trees coming out of the rosids, and it's out of the branch that leads you to the apple, green bean, but also flax. Okay, so apple tree and flax, that's where the willows show up. And this is just a reminder that down here in these asterids is where the fever tree showed up as a close relative of coffee. All right. So, willow bark was continued to be used until 1900. It wasn't that people still just brewed it as a tea. In the 1800s, people started doing chemical isolations from the bark. So they would, distill it into powders that you could buy, and that were much more concentrated. However, it was still coming from a natural source. But Bayer, which you may remember as the most famous name in all, aspirin, is because Bayer created the synthetic version of this, and they are the ones that dubbed it aspirin. Okay, so that used to be their word that they could use, and I think they still get to use it. I don't think anyone else can use the word aspirin. I'm not sure. Okay, but the synthetic version, instead of being salicin, okay, which was this chemical right here with a sugar attached, you had this ring right here with the sugar attached in the previous picture. Okay, well, they rip off the sugar and instead put an acetyl group in here. Okay, that's what that group is called. It's called an acetyl group. And the whole purpose of that is salicylic acid is kind of rough on the stomach, but acetyl salicylic acid is pretty benign to the stomach. And so Bayer came along and said, let's sell this drug to everybody. And they created this entire class of drugs that are called the NSAIDs. And you can read it right there. It stands for non-steroidal. So it kind of looks like a steroid, but isn't really a steroid. So it's non-steroidal, it's anti-inflammatory, and it's a drug, the NSAIDs. All right, other famous NSAIDs that were invented after aspirin and because of aspirin, we went looking for other ways. Ibuprofen is less harmful to the stomach even than aspirin. And naproxen sodium is stronger and it's longer lasting. Okay, but these all exist because of the original aspirin here being created. Also, aspirin works particularly well when combined with caffeine. And of course, as you remember, caffeine is an extract from the asterids down here, the coffee or the tea. So we're mixing willow bark with coffee or tea extract. And, Bayer, one of the first things that they did to maintain their patent was reformulate it to include caffeine so they could keep their patent for a little while longer. All right. Now let's move on to the aloe plant. The aloe plant is terribly controversial, particularly in my family, and we'll talk about why in a minute. Okay, aloe has been used for centuries and is a very effective treatment for constipation, which you probably haven't thought of, and that's probably not what you're used to thinking of aloe plants for. But aloe plant has a cholesterol-like compound here. Okay, so all these rings, waxy, okay, attached to a glucose. So that makes it a glycoside. Okay, so there you go. That's one of 24 interesting substances in the aloe plant is the aloin. All right, so there you go. That's that stuff to use to treat constipation. Okay, and you take that orally. Now, is it good for burns and skin irritation? Yes, it's got anti-inflammatory agents. It produces salicylic acid as well, so it's like a combination of aspirin. It's also got antibacterial and antifungal chemicals in it. So it does work if you have nothing else to put on the burn. However, it's hard to determine if this is doing anything more than your standard antifungal, antibacterial regimen. So Neosporin, for example, is 3 combined chemicals that will attack bacteria and fungi. And so if you've got a burn, because we have modern day chemistry, we know Neosporin works. It's kind of hard to determine that whether or not aloe is of particular benefit beyond that. So there you go. That's a little bit of the controversy there. It has for centuries also been used for burns back before we had over-the-counter, even out in front of the counter, antibiotic creams. Okay, so the whole genus Aloe, of which there's like 45 plants that fall into the genus Aloe. The most common one is called aloe vera. All right, but other members of the genus also produce these same chemicals. All of them, though, are native to the Arabian countries, more the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so right near Africa. Okay, these guys are monocots. All right, so they're not in the astrid or rosid game. These guys jump out and join onions in the asparagale group. Okay, so these guys are close relative to onions, and I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute. Once again, these have inflorescence flowers. Okay, so far every flower we've talked about has been an inflorescence. We're going to keep talking about them. And these guys are perennial in the tropics. Okay, and they will grow outdoors in southern Georgia. They will survive the winter and keep growing. But they're also very popular as indoor plants. They are very hard to kill. The easiest way to kill your aloe vera plant is to overwater it. Because it kind of, lives a little bit more like a grass/cactus. It's a drier climate plant. I mean, go figure. It comes from the Arabian Peninsula. All right. The original purpose of aloin, okay, in the plant, the reason the plant's producing it is probably that it has a laxative effect on animals. That would be a great way to convince animals not to eat you if every time they ate you, they had a very, explosive result. So this is one of those examples of a secondary plant product, kind of like caffeine, having a more notifiable or identifiable reason for existing. It's a little harder to figure out why that salicin is in willow bark, because I don't know, what's the tree trying to do? Get rid of my headaches if I chew on its bark? So that may be more coincidental. But this aloin probably represents specific evolution to get herbivores to stop eating it. Now, here's that relationship that I talked about. So you've got the monocots here. All right. So inside, we're still in angiosperms. We're still in that Magnolia phyta group. And so you have monocot and dicot in there. And these were those monocots, like all of our grasses and our corn. Onions, vanilla, and aloe are all going to go together as a close relationship. Now, aloe juice, and I emphasize the juice because it won't contain aloin, but the juice, the liquid part that can come out of the plant, is a very common additive. If you're going to put lotions or soaps or heck, even Kleenex on your face, people love putting the word aloe on it because everybody knows that that's hypothetically good for your skin. This has never been a synthesized product, and part of the reason why is there's over 24 interesting molecules in aloe. We don't know which ones have which effects, if any, and so we're kind of stuck using the natural thing. It's similar to tobacco. We don't synthesize tobacco because there's lots of compounds in tobacco. So to try to chemically produce the right balance of all of them so that a cigarette smoker gets whatever drug profile that they prefer, it's very hard. Just like with aloe, we're not going to try. So instead, we grow the aloe plant, we juice it. We grow it, we juice it. Now, there is conflicting evidence of whether or not this has a benefit. So, if you get a sunburn or you have a skin condition of some sort and you put a lotion on it and you're paying attention to it and you're patting it dry because you're not scrubbing at it and blah, 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 all the different things. It's hard to tell whether or not the aloe had benefit or if it was just all those other activities you were doing, including any lotion. All right. So there's not strong evidence that aloe as an additive actually does anything for you. However, there is some pretty strong evidence that you believe it's doing something for you. And since your whole point is to be happier, like, yes, you have a sunburn and you would like it to go away, but what you really want is to not be unhappy because of pain. That's what a sunburn does. It makes you unhappy because it hurts. All right. Well, so if you believe that the aloe is soothing the pain really will go away, and therefore you've gotten what you wanted, which was feeling less pain and or being happier. So I don't want to dismiss the psychosomatic effects of some herbal compounds. If the compound makes you feel like your problem is less, then your problem is less. As long as we're not talking about some progressive medical condition that can hurt you if left untreated, if we're talking about something simple like, like a sunburn, or if we're like, I got a bee sting, I'm going to put some aloe on it. If we're talking about small things that don't have a long-term effect, psychosomatic cures are a great way to go. Whether or not this is the only benefit of it, I don't know. Quick note about that aloe extract being used as a laxative. Yeah, don't do that anymore. There's some toxicity associated with it, and so consuming of the wax that grows beneath the skin of the plant, that's bad juju, so we don't do that anymore. Also, funny side note, look who owns the Banana Boat brand. The Energizer Bunny was out in the sun too long with those shades, and with his he kept going and going, and apparently he got a sunburn. All right, let's move on to chemotherapy. And I had originally planned on doing 2 chemotherapies, but this lecture was getting long enough that I was like, I'll just go with 1. So we are going to describe a chemotherapy as an extremely complicated plant molecule. It's not going to have a repeatable structure. So chemotherapy to chemotherapy, these things are wacky complicated, and sometimes they involve more than one molecule attached to each other. And so we're not going to try to give them a chemical classification. We are going to pick one of them and talk about the specific kinds of cancer that it treats best. And we'll talk about the name of the drug. Then we'll talk about the plant it comes from, just like before. And then we'll talk about whether or not it's still used. And there we'll have an interesting little story about economics and plants and medicine, and you're really going to like that one. Okay, so what is chemotherapy? By definition, any drug that is called a chemotherapy is used to kill cancer cells. That's what it does. Now, it also kills healthy cells, but it kills more cancer cells than it kills healthy cells. So when you're thinking chemotherapy, you're thinking a poison that is dosed to do more harm to cancer than to the rest of you. All right? These are all complicated. So the one we're going to talk about is vincristine, and I can't even look at that thing. Okay, so you're seeing something that looks like a whole bunch of different alkaloids crammed together. I mean, this part right here vaguely resembles, quinine, and this part right here, for all the world, looks just like cholesterol, but except there's nitrogen in it. What the heck? So there's no repeating pattern to these guys. And that's part of why we needed a plant to invent them to begin with. Okay, we would never sit down to synthesize this exact molecule just to figure out what it did. All right, so a lot of our chemotherapies that are derived straight from plants are because, how would you ever come up to think of making that on your own? All right. Now, interesting note, everything I've talked about so far has been part of ancient medicine. And this chemotherapeutic called vincristine isn't part of ancient medicine because the concept of chemotherapy just wasn't even invented until the 1940s. It was a product of World War II as well. All right, so we're going to be looking at this guy. Let's go ahead and take a look. Oh, pretty flower. Yeah, I'm distracting you with a pretty flower because now we're going to talk about leukemia. Oh, dang it. All right, there is a flower called the rosy periwinkle. Okay, this is the rosy periwinkle. Say hi to Rosie. All right. It's been used in traditional medicine all across the East, okay, to cure diabetes. So in the 1950s, some scientists sat down and said, hey, let's investigate this cure to diabetes. And sad for them, it didn't work. And I don't know how they noticed this. But when they're testing, I'm going to assume they're working with mice with diabetes. They're taking health information on the mice. They notice the mice are showing some anemic symptoms, like they're not producing bone marrow. And so they're like, hey, this stuff, this rosy periwinkle crab blocks bone marrow growth. And they said, aren't leukemia and lymphoma cancers of white blood cells? And don't they reside in your bone marrow? So you see, leukemia and lymphoma, the treatments for those are about attacking the bone marrow. Sometimes it's about literally killing all the bone marrow. If you hear about people being a bone marrow donor or a bone marrow recipient, very often it's because they had leukemia, and we needed to kill off their bone marrow to get rid of the cancer and then donate new bone marrow that was healthy back. All right. Well, we try not to do that because that's a pretty dangerous procedure, because if we kill off your bone marrow, we're killing off your ability to make red cells, white cells, and platelets. Basically everything important about your blood. So it would be nice if instead we had some chemicals we could use. All right, and so that's when vincristine is going to come in. Now I should pause and talk about rose periwinkle. All right. The rose periwinkle is native to Madagascar, and I find a ridiculous number of people don't know where Madagascar is. Madagascar is off the eastern coast, down near South Africa. Okay, so it's kind of interesting to think of a plant from Madagascar making its way all the way up into China and being used as part of Chinese traditional medicine, but there you go. Okay. It is an asterid, and it's going to be one of those close relatives of coffee again. So, gee, the coffee family is getting pretty big. So we have the fever tree, and now we have the periwinkle. And yay, finally, a solitary flower. Everything before here was just all of these inflorescences. Okay. It is a very common hanging potted plant. So people love to put these in these hanging baskets. They produce a bajillion of this really pretty flower right here, just studding all over them. All right. And even though it's perennial in the tropics, it can't really survive winter. So in the United States, it's considered an annual pretty much everywhere except Miami. It's going to die off, so people buy it every year. Okay. And that's going to be important. Oh, yes, here's its relationship in the asterids. Here's your coffee. There's that fever tree we just talked about, and now we're adding periwinkle to it, that rose periwinkle. Now, what's important about annual versus perennial and stuff like this is that while you can produce vincristine synthetically, in 2004 some people succeeded, there's about like 6 different ways people have come up with producing it, and none of them are really good. They're not cost effective, and it's hard to bring them up to scale. So you still, even today, have dozens of groups competing to try to find a way to produce this synthetically. And the reason why is it takes a ton of periwinkle leaves to produce 1 ounce of vincristine. Are you kidding me? 1 ounce of this stuff. Okay, that's like 2 milligrams of the chemical. Okay, so this vial right here that has 1 milligram in it had 1,000 pounds of leaves ground up and extracted to create it. Holy crap. That's like half a ton, right? Okay, now, this medication was originally produced in like 1960, so it's hit the generic mark, where it's now being produced as a generic. And so there's only produced by 2 companies. It's produced by Teva, which is a major pharmaceutical company in Israel. And if you don't know it, a lot of American pharmaceuticals are actually produced in Israel. They're a big manufacturer. Okay, but then also Pfizer. Pfizer. Okay, Big Daddy Pfizer. One of the biggest names in big pharma. And oh, evil Pfizer. Right? Well, here's an interesting thing. So this is 2020 right now. So in July of 2019, Teva said, yeah, we're not making much money off this thing that we have to grind, 1,000 pounds of leaves to make a vial of it. So we're going to quit making it. And Pfizer, even though Pfizer was still the majority of the production, so it was like 90% of the production was still coming from Pfizer. If you tell Pfizer in July, hey, you need to ramp up your production by like 10%, Pfizer goes, you're cute. We produce it in Texas. So if we planted the flowers now, they die. Uh-oh. Because, yeah, Texas has a winter. So Pfizer hasn't been able to expand production. And that 10% shortfall in the production of vincristine has suddenly made a cheap, hard to produce, thin profit margin chemical critically short. And vincristine is still one of the primary medications for treating childhood leukemia. So a major problem has occurred because, and here's the weird thing, the drug was too cheap to buy. So that thin profit margin caused one drug manufacturer to go, look, we can't make a profit on this drug, so we have to quit. And another manufacturer went, wait, we can't catch up that fast. Can you give us a little warning? And suddenly, we've got some kids that don't have a good outlook for their leukemia. Now, it's not like suddenly everyone with childhood leukemia had the problem, but together they were making 100% of the supply. So 100% of the need was being met, and now only 90% of the need is being met. Okay, and just in case you're looking down here, Oncovin was the original trade name for vincristine when it was first produced in the 1960s by the Eli Lilly Corporation. Okay, but they don't produce it anymore because when the patent ran out, it really, once again, wasn't making them much money, but it sure was taking a ton of leaves to produce two vials. Okay, so that's really an interesting story about industry and cost benefit and how shortages happen. Outside of this lecture, a person who just notices a drug shortage might go, oh, Pfizer's just trying to squeeze us for more money. When in reality, Pfizer would love to make more, but there's realities of the fact that Pfizer's producing it in the northern hemisphere, not at the equator, and so they can't plant a whole bunch more of this plant. I mean, acres and acres, thousands of acres of this periwinkle would have to be planted to make up for what Teva was going to make. Okay, so it's a little more complicated than we like to treat it sometimes, and I bet you that is also another short answer question.